Good morning. I'm Bonnie Gardner. I'm co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin at 4700 Grover Avenue. Our forums are every Sunday at noon. We encourage you to attend. They are free, open to the public. For more information about our forums, you can go to our website at www.austinuu.org. Today, I am honored and very glad to have Mr. Nelson Linder, who is the president of the Austin chapter of the NAACP, speaking on equity as a basis for city government. He's going to be talking about the new 10-1 system for city elected officials, which was part of Arthur B. DeWitty's vision for a new Austin city government that would be much more representative. So how does he envision the new system providing more opportunities and equities for communities that have been largely ignored under the at-large system? He'll also speak on various social justice issues as he's talking. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He is Mr. Nelson Linder, a longtime civil rights advocate, a fearless one. And in 1992, he founded the Garvey Allen Washington Project, which focused on empowerment and social justice for African Americans and other groups. He's a host of an Austin community radio station, KAZI's program Wake Up Call, and he's currently working on his book, which is entitled The Empowerment Mode and the Price of Nonconformance. He's dedicated to promoting civil rights, educational equity, and he also, he's a graduate of Houston-Tillotson University, and he owns his own insurance agency here in Austin. Let's give a warm welcome to Mr. Nelson Linder.
Good morning. I'm very honored to be here. I am Nelson Linder. I'm the president of the Austin NAACP. We're a very old organization. We do address things like civil rights and social justice. And I can tell you that even in spite of our work in 2013, that there's so much work to be done because there's so little understanding. And so as we educate and inform people, there's always need to make sure that we establish meaningful relationships so we know what we're talking about and we can address it sincerely. And oftentimes I always kind of complain that we're an information-based society, but we're not really deciphering and applying the information. That's part of our challenge. In fact, as I was thinking this morning, I thought about Plato's Republic, which is a very powerful document, but we really don't read it anymore. We just kind of skim over it in classes and philosophy classes. But really, it talks about a just state for all people. It really does. It addresses things like justice and the role of the state and the role of man in that process. But I can tell you that in America in 2013, despite what we say we are in terms of our Constitution, when you look at it closely, there's a huge gap between what we say and what we do. And so I want to make sure that at some point we'll begin to understand that process, because it's one thing to talk about what you're doing. It's another thing to practice what you're doing. My quest for justice preceded anything ever happening in Austin, Texas. I was born in Macon, Georgia in 1958. I understood early on that without an education in the society, you really can't be effective. And I'm a product, I think, of a pretty well-rounded education. And so to that extent, it's allowed me to not only travel the world, but also to go into very unfamiliar environments and share ideas that are meaningful. Because too often in this city and other places, we don't really go outside of our comfort zone. So as a result, a lot of things never get addressed between folks of different ethnicity, different perspective, different ideology. And so these gaps remain. Let me tell you why I chose the topic today, equity as a basis for city government. Many of you here might know Arthur B. DeWitty. In 1951, he was an African American here who had the courage to run for city council. And he upset a lot of people because at that time, African Americans weren't supposed to run for city council. He ran for city council and was almost elected. And as a result, at the time they had a system of proportional representation. They changed the entire system to an at-large system. So for almost 50 years, nobody black again ever ran for city council. Let me tell you why that's important in 2013. Last November, we elected, for the first time in the city's history, what they call a single-member district system. And I know, and you know, that no political system is going to solve all of our problems. But at least it gives us a basis for at least having what I call direct representation that we elect, and also for kind of a smaller government where your neighborhoods play a major role in what you do in terms of your activities. Under the at-large system, there were many people who were not even involved in Austin's political system. I gave you a document you have right now in your hands. It shows you that for the past 50 years, essentially 4 zip codes elected Austin leadership. And those 4 zip codes were west of I-35. And I think that's unfortunate that the city is bright and is prosperous and as progressive as Austin's supposed to be. Yet for almost 60 years, we had 4 zip codes making our political choices. That means all the other folks in South Austin and far southwest Austin, East Austin, they picked their own elected leaders. What do I mean by that? What has happened is that this city, in spite of all this prosperity, has a huge wage gap issue. It's not only west, east, and west, it's also north and south. In fact, I was at a program last week, and they were talking about the fact that there are gaps in terms of voter turnout between North and South Austin and East and West Austin, and the question was why. And we're very comfortable blaming folks for not voting, and surely it's a constitutional responsibility. I always say, as a challenge, though, why don't we find out why folks are not voting? And I think if we ask that question and begin to look at why they're not voting, and many times we'll get some pretty good answers. Oftentimes people feel disconnected, as if they don't matter, as if nobody's really talking to them. And the history proves that, because our politics is always centered around a small area of folks who are essentially powerful people who made decisions for everybody else. And as a result, this is really the tale of 2 cities. I'm happy to say that in 2013, finally, we have a chance to change that whole political and economic and philosophical equation. That's why we say 10 to 1. I say the basis for equity in city government. Now, I know, you know, that dealing with people, a lot of things won't change. But I do think if you have the right foundation, at least you're headed in the right direction. But let's talk about this new government that we see forming in Austin, Texas. Because right now, they've already put forward maps that will show you the new 10 districts and where folks are. And again, a lot of those folks have never had any direct role in choosing their own leadership. And there are a lot of people in the city right now with money and power who can control the growth here who are a little bit nervous about that. I think that's a good thing, that finally the little folks can play a role in the city who pay the same tax rate, by the way, but don't get the same services. And there are so many folks who are comfortable with that. And why are people so comfortable having one tax rate, yet when you look at East Austin and West Austin, you see the differences. You look at North and South, you see the differences. But back to my point about East versus West. You know, the turnout, of course, is always much higher in West Austin. So the question was, why is that? Well, of course, we can say that when folks feel like government listens to them and pay attention to their needs, they have more power. There's more of an incentive to turn out and vote. On the other hand, if you live in East Austin, where you have poor streets, poor roads, poor representation, little resources, obviously there's a distrust between the populace and the government. That's not that complicated. So what we're trying to do now is to address the fact that we think if folks have a role to play in who they elect, they're also going to probably, for the most part, be more involved in that political system. As an example, if you study the European system, especially what we call now Western Europe, which is more social democratic, they have parliaments, and in those parliaments, it's never a winner-take-all system. Every political party has some sort of representation. Whether you win or lose, somebody that thinks your ideas probably has a seat. And what it means is, if there is a conversation, your interests are going to be talked about, and that means a lot to most people. But in this city, most of its history, we don't talk about issues that affect people who are black, brown, and poor who don't have power at City Hall. Why is that important? You know, in 1865, around the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil War, in 1870, there were 5 black settlements in this city that were formed by independent black people. They were autonomous people. Clarksville, very little of it left in the city today. It's almost gone because of gentrification. Places like Kitchenville, independent people, independent communities. Places like Pleasant Hill. Those were independent black folks in 1870 who built their own communities and thrived and did quite well. But we don't talk about Masontown, those places. How did people survive in 1870 without what we call political representation. Well, they had a strong bond and strong communities. But all those things changed in 1927-28 when the city of Austin had a master plan, and they essentially put all black folks east of I-35 in East Austin, and as a result, if you didn't cooperate, you wouldn't get utility services. So that political service changed this entire city. And I kind of remind folks that when I see 10-1 today, it's like we've come full circle now to where a city is going to have people all over the city, as it should be, living in all kinds of communities, black, brown, whatever, and it's a more diverse population. I think that's a good thing and a basis for equity. But in 1870, African Americans was 30% of Austin's population. Most folks don't know that. We worked on the Everett Wallace construction crew. We helped build the state capitol. So I'll say when we talk about empowering everybody, we're not asking for anything. We're saying it's an obligation. The very folks who built this city are not oftentimes included in this wealth and this prosperity. I think that's a major problem. But we tolerate it and we don't address it. Also, the state of Texas in 1870 was 30% black. So during that period of time, there were a lot more African Americans in this city and in this entire state. Now, but Austin changed. Today in Austin, Texas, we have an 8% black population. It's been going downhill since the 1970s. Things like gentrification, the cost of living, I think also the at-large political system. Why is it our population keeps going down? Well, obviously, gentrification, the cost of living. This right now is probably the most expensive city in the country for families. We don't talk about that. So the folks who are marginalized, who don't have good jobs or have very high unemployment rates, can't live here. So the old areas like East Austin, 7702, 23, 24, 25, those folks have been pushed out to places like Manor, Del Valley, Pflugerville, and those areas where they can afford the cost of housing. These are all real issues that we don't really want to address. So now all of a sudden, in the past election, we had 30 different coalitions, including libertarians, including folks from the Tea Party, the Republican Party, folks who communicated. How is that? All these different folks all of a sudden had a common interest and they had a basis for cooperating. That's why we say that in any meaningful city in 2013 in this country, equity should be a conversation all over this nation. And we really can't have a true democracy if we're not willing to discuss and then address inequities. And you should know, you've had some bright folks come here, from the police chief to economists, and I always ask the question to them, we can't address or solve any of these issues until we realize that all of us are human beings. And despite our level of education or where we live, we should have the same opportunities for the most part in terms of human beings. Because you have a less education or a lower paying job, that'll make you less human. But we do a very good job of denying folks who are a certain color or certain income opportunities, and that needs to stop. But it won't stop until people like you continue to have these kinds of forums. And it's more than just a forum, because these forums to me are a way of making a statement to our larger society. And civil rights and social justice is more than just a forum. So the question is, how do we get from forums to everyday life? How do we take this conversation from outside of these pews to the corner of Quilt and Forever, or wherever you might live? So how do we change people's whole dynamics? And I think that's our challenge in 2013. I'm around a lot of bright, smart, intelligent people who know every technological thing in the world. They can do it. But when it comes to having a human conversation, where folks feel comfortable addressing issues, they really can't hardly do it. Why is that? We're such an intelligent nation. We lead the whole world in so many different aspects, but when it comes to listening and talking and going outside of our comfort zone and talking to different folks of different ethnicities, we struggle with that. Why? Why do we struggle with being different? Why do we struggle incorporating different ideas and ideologies? I don't quite understand that. And I think it's in our spirits more so than just politics. And I think it's very easy to ignore that because so many of us are comfortable. And I can tell you something about the NAACP. I have to remind people, my life didn't start with NAACP. My life started as a simple country boy in Georgia in a family of 13. I had a father and mother with very little formal education. But one thing they had was they had a desire to work hard, a desire to raise their kids the right way, a desire to sacrifice for a better community, and the fact that we would have opportunities for education. That was our foundation, that I would have a chance at some point in my life that they didn't have, that I could go to college, and I could come back and build businesses that would employ people and also eradicate racism. And there are two things that happened during my lifetime that are very important. I brought two civil rights pens here today. I'm going to talk about those later, but I was born in 58, and in 64, they passed a thing called the Civil Rights Act. And if you are my age, you're a little older. Some of you are a little older. It transformed America because during the Civil Rights Act of 64, for the first time, African Americans could be hired in public facilities and public organizations. So all of a sudden, I'm going to pass this around later, black folks became police officers in many cases. They got jobs in city and state governments downtown, so folks had to deal with each other who in the past didn't have to. That was very important. That was a very important piece of legislation. Then also in 65, the Voting Rights Act. In case you haven't noticed, the Voting Rights Act right now is under attack. The Supreme Court this summer said that Section 5 was no longer relevant. They said the thing called pre-clearance, which means when you change your maps in a city or a county, it used to be you would have to subject those maps to D.C. or to a panel of judges. They said, well, things have changed now. You have black folks in all kinds of levels of power, so we don't need to do that anymore. And so they gutted Section 4. The good news is that Section 2, which covers discrimination, is a permanent provision of the Voting Rights Act. It's never going to go away. Things like voter ID all of a sudden are popping up all across the country. And all of a sudden now America is making it more difficult to vote. Why? I mean, what spirit is driving that? And I thought we had those problems addressed. Why are there things reoccurring all around the country in places like Texas, by the way, which has one of the worst, places like Georgia, North Carolina? I mean, it's amazing when young folks see this kind of dialogue taking place in 2013. So my son said, Dads, I thought we did this 40, 50 years ago. No, we didn't. We didn't sell these issues. We had a conversation, but we didn't address the real issues. We addressed the effects, not the causes. But these two pieces of legislation were very important in transforming America. I always remind folks, when you say government doesn't matter, you're not dealing with reality. Government matters almost for everything. I'm not saying it solves all of our problems, but it does provide a basis for us cooperating in a civil kind of way. As an African American, I can tell you in 1964 and 65, there was less than 100 black politicians in this whole country. Less than 100. In 2013, there are more than 10,000. So clearly, these things made a major difference in terms of representation. As a result, we've had increased levels of education, income, a lot of good things. But there's a population out there right now that's still poor, in many cases still overwhelmingly black and brown, that's not shared in our progress. When I say equity as a basis of city government, what I'm saying to you is that under your new city council, we're going to have to force people to get out into the city and share some of their wealth. Not in terms of giving anybody anything, but creating an environment where for schools who have not been given the proper resources can now have the proper resources. With jobs, I've got neighborhoods in my community that have 40% unemployment. We talk about, for example, the breakup of the black family and single-parent households. Can you imagine being in any community with 40% unemployment? If you were unemployed and your wife was unemployed and you had kids, what would you do? Would that affect how you think, how you study, how you rest, how you act? Would it? I think it would. I hear politicians who are millionaires talk about the breakup of the black family, not even talking about the fact that since the 1930s we've had what we call recession-level unemployment. Nobody addresses that. In fact, so you know, there's another label here. This is the March on Washington, 1963. We just celebrated its 50th anniversary. We were talking about education, things that had changed since then. Folks talk about Martin Luther King's speech, which is not really the point, by the way. The point is that a fellow named A. Philip Randolph, who's a union guy, organized that march for almost 30, 40 years. People like Bayard Rustin were workers, and they worked in the street. They organized it. They don't get credit for that. King was a spokesperson, but these guys were the workers. And like today, the workers don't always get credit. But in 1963, at the time of the March on Washington, we had a 12% unemployment rate nationally, black folks. Out of all of our successes, we came to one conclusion. In 2013, the black rate is actually higher. It's almost 13%. How do we explain that? And by the way, the name of the march was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. So what's happening here? We're not getting jobs created equally in parts of the city economically. And it's pretty obvious when you look at the city of Austin. I'm going to stay here because that's where I live. You look at East Austin, you see the lack of infrastructure. I have an office on 12th Street, less than a mile from the state capitol. I recall folks complaining about parking one day for their businesses outside. Then all of a sudden, 2 months later, there are bicycle lanes running down 12th Street. Nobody in those communities has ever really even rode bicycles because they couldn't afford to. The jobs they work at, you can't get to work in time on a bicycle. And by the way, when you get to work, you have to be dressed a certain way. But all of a sudden, people got together and organized and said, we want bicycle lanes in East Austin. Now bicycle lanes are all over East Austin. But yet, there's still a lack of infrastructure. There's a lack of business support. The city's not even really visible in many places, but yet somebody decided to create bicycle lanes, and they got it done. I didn't vote for it. The folks that didn't vote for it, but it got done. It tells you that there's still inequity in terms of how people think. They give certain people priorities. And I love bicycles. I think they're healthy overall. But there are folks who think that having a house for their kids, having a decent meal, having a food store where they can go buy something more than fast foods or cigarettes or beer or liquor is more important. All these things happen before our very eyes right here in Austin, Texas. Now, having said all that, we have an African-American city manager. We have an African-American superintendent, who we just honored, by the way. We have an African-American county sheriff. We have an African-American county judge. So the question becomes, what does that mean in 2013? What does it mean to have a black person, a white person in a leadership position? Does it mean anything? Perhaps it's more important to have a person who's in a leadership position who cares about everybody, who's willing to create policies that treat everybody pretty much the same. Because promoting individuals does not change institutions. When you elect a black sheriff and a black superintendent, they're dealing with the same history that you dealt with. Nothing has changed. In fact, one of the problems is when we put black people in high positions like the presidency, we expect them to wave a magic wand. There is no magic wand in this country. Never has been. So there's a false expectation that somehow our color is going to resolve these issues. It's not going to. And I get back, as hard as it might be, to one important point that people don't seem to understand. Despite who we are culturally, the thing we call race, our ethnicity, the truth is, when it comes to DNA, we're about 99% the same. Why is it that as human beings we have all this in common, yet things like where we live, how we look, how we speak, divide us so much? How do we explain that? Why do we get so much power to politics and economics and very little power to spirituality? Yet we all claim to be spiritual. Right now, folks, all over the city in churches, they're preaching sermons about love for Jesus, love for God. But out here in society, only a few folks are doing what you do. Only a few folks, there are some folks who wouldn't dare talk about inequity on Sunday morning. My God, Nelson, what are you referring to? Why should we? I mean, we're powerful, we're rich. We're talking about inequity on Sunday morning? We're worshiping Jesus. Of course, one of my duties is to make sure I question people like that and ask them a question. If Jesus was here today in 2013, what would he be? Would he be in your $5 million complex in West or East Austin? Or would he be somewhere on 12th Street with my folks who don't matter, who are living on the streets, who don't know where the next meal is going to come from? I think I know the answer to that question, but nobody wants to answer that question in the right place. So when I say equity as a basis for city government, it's about honesty. It's about forcing folks who have power to come outside their comfort zone, like Linder Johnson did in 64 and 63 in those years, and begin to look at a great society. What is a great society? And people like John Kennedy to talk about things like a new frontier. These are men who, despite having their own flaws, had the courage to talk about something new and different and to challenge America to reach its own ideal. In fact, when I talk about Plato's Republic, by the way, very, very powerful document about what constitutes a just state. There's a thing called the American Creed, and what it says is that regardless of your ideology or your party affiliation, there's one thing that government should do. It should protect our liberty and try to ensure all of us reach our potential. There's nothing Republican or Democratic or Libertarian about that. That's a pretty balanced philosophical statement. If somehow in this city we can get back to a system where I'm not talking about just idealism, where we really do try to make sure that this entire city is represented. We try to reduce our prison population by having more opportunities in education. We try to identify those folks who are mentally ill who need help and get them social help. We begin to fully implement the Affordable Health Care Act as it should be, where all Americans can have health care. If it's okay to invest in government, why is it not okay to invest in people? Don't people make the government? And I will say, until we begin to invest more in people and helping folks reach their potential, you really can't have a healthy government. As I close out, if you've seen D.C. lately, the Republicans and the Democrats and this nonsense about the debt ceiling and folks who would destroy the entire government because of a political philosophy, and we elect those kind of people. What are we thinking? What are we getting? Where are we headed? Do we really understand what we're doing in this nation today? We elect zealots and they destroy the whole nation, and they make everybody nervous. Do you think it is a coincidence that the very week we were fighting these battles in D.C., there was a woman who completely lost it mentally and was shot and killed in D.C. because she had mental issues? Nobody had thought to try to stop the car the right way with spikes. People were shooting first and asking questions later. Before that, we had another shooting in D.C. Do we not understand that there are consequences when we argue and fuss and fight at a high level? That for the little folks who are already on the threshold of almost losing it, if we lose it up here, and we're very comfortable, what do they have to hang on to? We don't think about consequences when our government fights and threatens each other. We don't even hold people accountable anymore. So we up here lose our stability. What about down here? When I talk about equity, I'm asking people to consider the fact that there are things that we can do that transcend ideology and politics. The things that make us human. All it takes is a little time, a little patience, a little understanding, a little investment. And I think as Americans, and as Austinites, given all of our advantages, I think that we can do that. And I think if we did that, we'd do our children a tremendous favor. As a final thought, my parents had very little money and very little opportunity, but they grew their own food. They survived off the environment. They were hunters and fishers and knew how to maximize basic things. And they gave us faith and hope that one day there'll be a better world where we could go out in the world and have a good education and run our own businesses and help our fellow man. That was my foundation. And the more I began to evolve as a human being and travel and saw the world, I realized that was not reality. That's not what folks are trying to build. That people were very selfish and that we had a responsibility, the few of us who are left, to demand that they accept a new reality where we do treat people as human beings, that we invest in all parts of this city, where everybody has a kind of a representation, regardless of race, creed, religion, color, and that we begin to embrace the Constitution for what it is and quit quoting it and actually implement it. Having said that, I've kind of reached my time limit, so I'm going to stop there and I guess go to the next part of the program and take some questions.
Thank you.
My question is on 3, the Proposition 3, the council members that are currently on the council, since they do not live in the certain districts that are going to be made up, is that going to change? Or when are the elections for the full 10 seats?
Thank you very much. Fortunately, one of your colleagues in this church is on the ICRC. And next year, once those maps are drawn and accepted and implemented, no, the current city council, you can only run in your particular district. They're going to be required to run where they live. So next year, you're going to have a whole new election for the most part that is based on folks, number one, living in that district before they can even file and run for it. Now, some of those folks will probably be running for other positions, obviously. Most of them want to be mayors. That's no secret. But as far as where you live, you're going to have a chance to elect your own representative. And no, those folks who don't live in districts can't run anymore. And that's a good thing about this system. It's not a perfect system. It's going to demand that you run where you live. It's going to have a more diverse population. And I think you're going to see more council people run for public office. So the answer is no. They won't be able to run unless they live in that district as a resident. And that's a good thing.
First of all, just wanted to say that I agree with you that I think that the European method of proportional representation is far superior to us. But I think the whole question of this 10-1 system is that while it promotes democracy in some ways, in other ways it gets us back to the same problem that we have in the House of Representatives today, which is that you can't complain that the representatives don't represent people. They have gerrymandered the districts so that some districts are overwhelmingly minority and are going to vote for minority candidates, and other districts the representatives aren't likely to give a flying hoot about where minorities are. Aren't we better in some ways to have a system where everybody has to be looking for every constituency of the population for a vote?
I would say that we tried that system and it didn't work. It didn't work because everybody was not in the same house. I would argue that if everybody's in the same room, they're going to be forced to cooperate. Let me give you an example, my own self as an example. I was appointed to the Charter Revision Committee by Mayor Pro Tem Cheryl Cole. When I went out into the city, I met folks I'd never seen before in the Republican Party who were good people, libertarians. I met all kinds of people. I'd never seen them before. In meeting those people, despite having differences, we began to agree on the basis of government. And so having met those people as human beings, even though we were different, we found a way to cooperate. See, I don't think being different is a problem. I think folks have to understand that in any government, there has to be cooperation. And I think when you put 10 people in a room who are very different, it allows them to cooperate, because if you don't get anything done. And I would say, given what has happened in the at-large system, clearly this system has a potential to be much more progressive. We don't know yet, of course, but at least the concept is something different where you have more voices in the room. And I think that way it's going to encourage a lot of folks who never vote, who lost faith in government, to at least get more involved and be more participatory in their own solutions.
I previously lived in Houston and Dallas, which are, of course, big oil cities, but they don't have the transportation problems we have. It's been a big shock since I've moved here in 2007, how we're always rerouting the bus systems for what are supposed to be special events. Do you think that implementation of the 10-1 system will improve our public transportation networks, which are used by low-income communities and also people with disabilities who don't have a choice if they're going to use public transportation systems?
If you look at Capital Metro today and the city of Austin, they have a very close relationship based on special interests. They can treat very high-priced trains around from Cedar Park, Linder to Austin, but nobody's addressing Eastern Travis County. To prove your point, most of the workers in the city who are blue-collar workers who need to get to work live in Eastern Travis County. Places like Applied Material and Samsung have no basis for transportation. So, yes, if you have reps in that area, they're going to be demanding, number one, that Metro reorganize and begin to address their purposes, because we're all paying for the same tax rate. For example, toll roads. It's not of a coincidence that you have these toll roads out in these poor areas like Del Valley where nobody's using them. But when they first built those roads, they didn't ask us. They did it anyway. So, yeah, I think now you're going to see folks who are poor, who need to have public transportation, get it, because I can tell you right now, a lot of folks who are running for office next year believe in public transportation. They also believe in equity, and they know that the city of Austin has not addressed Eastern Travis County of East Austin. And they're going to demand that Metro be more responsive to train lines, not just north, just west and east, but also Eastern Travis County, even Bastrop, Maine or more, Del Valley, which has nothing, by the way, Pflugerville. They're going to demand that those areas get addressed with the simple basis of equity. So I think you'll get a lot of changes now in public transportation because the voices now are being heard.
Would you help me understand how the 10-1 issue is going to affect gentrification?
Right now, of course, there's a big ban on affordable housing. That failed during the last election. If you look at housing choices in Austin for the past, I would say, 10, 20 years, the folks who were living in East Austin, where most of the gentrification occurred, had increasing tax rates pushed them out. They couldn't live there. But the homes that were being built that they could afford were actually out in Manor and Del Valley and those places where they could afford homes. What I'm seeing now is an effort to build more affordable housing in those areas, like perhaps 02, 23, 24, 25. The folks who are on the city council next year who come from those areas are going to be demanded to invest more in those areas. They're going to be demanded to produce a product that will allow folks who qualify to buy homes in those areas. Once again, it's a marketplace decision. Give you an example. Let's take Mueller, for example. Miller, you guys call it Miller. I have to say Mueller based on how it reads, but basically get my point. You know, when they built Mueller back in, about 10 years ago, it's in East Austin. They promised us that they would have a diverse population, black, brown, all people. Yet it's about 90% non-black. It didn't happen because nobody who lives there was politically connected. So I think now you're going to see some proposals come here from folks who can build affordable housing, who are black and brown like me, who are going to be dedicated to those communities. I sense, for example, now that the gentrification rate is actually slowing somewhat, but without housing being built in areas affordably, it's not going to change. So I think the 10-1s are going to demand, first of all, more equity, and then more housing be built in East Austin, those areas where they haven't had it traditionally. That's a big conversation. I feel pretty certain the folks who are running for office are going to demand that resources be shifted more to that area to allow folks to build homes and begin to lower some of the property rates in those areas. That's just my theory. Thank you.
We have a question from Douglas Bauer.
First, I want to thank you for an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
I live in southwest Austin, Circle C area, and we debated, like everybody else, the various merits of a 10-1. And in that particular area, we're way outside the, few golden precincts that you pointed out as being, carrying a lot of weight in the Austin system. So in that sense, we felt kind of isolated. On the other hand, that part of Austin is what I would call purple area. During high turnout years where a lot of people vote, it's blue. During off-season, it can be other things. So we weren't sure how it was going to affect us in the long term. So my question is, I realize 10-1 is fait accompli at this point, but what were your thoughts about the other options, like, say, an 8-2-1 or maybe even like a 16-1, something that even more finely subdivided it? I was wondering if you could comment on that.
It's a good question. Based on my studies, when you begin to have a mixed political system, and for example, in your case, 8-1, what I know from experience is that the folks who proposed that were on the current city council, and what they wanted to have was a more at-large seats so they could run for those seats and maintain some power. And I believe if you start creating seats where one district is bigger than the other, you're creating another basis for inequity. I just think if you have 10 seats where there's equal population by law, and you have a mayor at large, you're going to have a stronger mayor form of government. He's going to have to talk to everybody. And the city council is going to have to address it. Anytime you talk about mixed systems, 8-1, whatever you want, I mean, if it's got a mixed system, by definition, you're treating inequity because those folks are going to have more clout than the folks who have the single-member districts. I just think that the basis of it would be unfair based on we know that what they were trying to do, that came from the city council, and they told us that they thought that by having that kind of system, you can have some of your current folks maintain their seniority and leadership and experience in that system. We just think it didn't work. It didn't work because the folks I worked with wanted to have equal seats, equal population across the board. And I just think that would be an unfair political system, personally.
We have a question here from Phil Hewitt.
Mr. Linder, thank you for coming today.
Thank you, sir.
My name is Phil Hewitt. I'm actually one of the 14 commissioners. And Mr. Linder, one of the things that we have wrestled with time and time again, and I know that you know this better than almost anybody around, is the importance of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and how it will affect the 10 council districts. We know that Section 4 was disqualified by the Supreme Court recently, but we still have Section 3. Would you mind explaining that to all of us? I think it's a really important thing.
Sure. The basis of the Voting Rights Act of 65 is one thing, that you cannot dilute the minority vote. That's the first principle. Under the current system, they actually invalidated Section 4 to basically disempower Section 5. And what they meant was back in the 1965, Section 4, you had to have a 50% turnout. It was based on minority turnout. And so it was relevant back then because folks weren't turning out at high levels. What the Supreme Court said was that in 2013 that the black vote turnout had increased. And because it was increased, Section 4 was no longer relevant. So as a result, Section 4 empowers Section 5. So once you destroy Section 4, there was no Section 5. Here's what's important. What we're addressing right now is under Section 2. Section 2 says that discrimination is illegal. Things like striking, packing, those things, minority vote dilution, that's illegal. So any form of discrimination will be addressed through Section 2. That's why we demanded that, for example, in District 1, which is the African American so-called district, anything that dissolves that population and makes the percentages lower will be a potential violation. So I would say, despite the changes and confusion that came from the Supreme Court, the most important thing is that Section 2 is still there. And so we can still address any kind of striking or any kind of packing, any kind of political maneuvering to dilute the minority vote through the Voting Rights Act. It's still there. It's just not as comprehensive. But as far as discrimination, this is as popular as it ever was. Remember, the only difference is that under Section 5, well, not Section 5 now, you don't require pre-clearance. For example, when you guys finish your work, you won't have to get permission from anybody in D.C. But guess what? If we think it's discriminatory, we're going to sue you. I'm only kidding, you know that. So, yeah. So the power is still there, basically. Yeah.
I was really shocked when I heard that there was discussion of closing down neighborhood swimming pools and neighborhood libraries during the summer as a cost-cutting mechanism. And when I think that particularly lower income and minority students or children need access to these kinds of facilities, would this be kind of an example of a city council that is weighted more perhaps to the interests of highly educated West Austin elite?
Absolutely. In fact, beyond the swimming pools and rec centers, there was also a place called Colony Park where we were going to put in a whole new development. And they did so without consulting the neighborhoods. Now, to the neighborhood's credit, even under this political system, when they talked about shutting down pools, people organized and came to several commissions. I chair one of them called the African American Resource Advisory Commission. Those neighborhoods mobilized, and as a result, they demanded the city council address their concerns. And thank God, when it became a public issue, they refunded some of those centers. But to prove your point, obviously, if you've got folks who live in those areas who go to city council meetings on a regular basis, they can nip this stuff in the bud. When these conversations come up, they can say, wait a minute, this is unfair to our community, as opposed to an afterthought or reaction. In our case nowadays, when they take away funding for minority programs in East Austin or any community, we get it secondhand. Under a true representative system, that will be discussed in the chambers, and opposition can be announced while it's taking place as opposed to us reacting. Because nowadays, sometimes when we react, we're not effective. So now it's going to ensure that people have the potential to address these things while they've been formulated, and that way perhaps in many cases it never actually happens. I mentioned Colony Park where they built a rec center out there, and they built it improperly. It was so poorly built they had to tear it down. It's in the black community. Turner Roberts Rec Center. Those kind of things don't happen in West Austin. Those folks fought for 3 years to put it on the city council agenda. City council wouldn't do it. They brought it to commissions, and once we demanded it, they did it. But they wouldn't talk to the people at first. So back to your point, if you've got folks who live there in those communities, rather than taking 3 years, it might never become a problem in the first place, or if at least a problem, they can address it publicly and begin to expose people. That would be, to me, the advantage of having a district-based system. You're a lot closer to the government, and your reps can talk to you on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm. I can remember visiting a library in East Austin and seeing young black men lining up, waiting to get access to a computer, and the computer is the connection to the larger world.
Great point, and that's another thing, too. If you look at the libraries in East Austin and rec centers, there's a huge difference in quality. Same city, same parks and recs, but yet the centers in East Austin have few computers, less access, less hours of operation. They don't even cut the grasses in some places. Why is that? Nobody's paying attention.
I have a friend that's extremely concerned about technique of trading one vote for another vote from one member of the council on the new plan. Maybe they don't basically support something, but they'll trade votes with another council member in order to get something for their district and vote in something that's not good for the whole community, like influence of developers wanting to do a big project that the area doesn't want. But anyway, trade-offs. Is that a legitimate concern, or maybe that could happen just as well with the current system?
I think we'd be very naive to think that in any political system, folks don't sometimes trade things off and make compromises. That's just the American way. I do believe that more folks who come out of those systems are a little bit closer to government, and you got more of a direct way to address those kinds of issues. For example, if people are horse trading unfairly, you can put them out of office a lot faster. So I think there's an incentive in the single member systems to hold people more accountable. And I would say in those kind of systems, because it's smaller government, the big money has less power. But sure, some folks are going to cut deals. I think that is a legitimate concern. But I think when you study the systems around the country that have these kinds of systems, by the way, they are the majority, it's not so much the problem at all. There are going to be differences of opinion. There's going to be folks who have a certain perspective that's smaller. But I think at the end of the day, we're going to have to make people see the big picture as well, that the parts do make the whole. The wholes don't make the parts make the whole. So I think it's going to force folks to talk more and communicate more and work out a balance. And I really think also, we haven't really discussed this, it's going to demand a lot more from the mayor. A person who's a lot craftier, a lot more involved, who's able to see the big picture. So I think the mayor in this system is going to have a lot more power. But I do think there's a mechanism to force people to look beyond their own personal interests and also work based on a coalition. Remember now, without majority vote, without consensus, nothing still occurs.
My question is, the strategy is changing for candidates running for the new 10-1 district. What is your advice for these new districts and for potential candidates? What strategy should they have to run for office? And how affordable do you think it's going to be in this new 10-1?
Here's my strategy. I think the folks who run for office in the 10-1 should not be Johnny-come-latelys. In other words, they can't just show up wanting to run for political office. As neighborhoods, you know who's been working in your community. You know the folks who are involved in the problem-solving situations. They're already there. I would encourage neighborhoods to make sure you begin to pick people and work with folks who've already been committed, not folks who want political opportunities. So I think we have an advantage now. Anybody that shows up nowadays without community-based support is going to kind of stand out. And while money might help them somewhat, the bottom line is that if you don't know who they are, if they weren't present when certain issues occurred, they don't have very much credibility. And what I'm seeing now for the first time, I talk to a lot of people, I see a lot of folks who have a very impressive track record, but weren't really involved at a high level because of money, but they know who the community people are. So now you can know your representation because they've been active. You can actually promote them. So I don't think it's going to be a big problem. I think there's a safeguard to ensuring that folks who run these neighborhoods now, they just are going to be known based on what they've done in the past. And I will caution people, for the folks who change their address and zip codes, who all of a sudden want to run for office, I think the flag should go up. Just ask them, what have you done for us in the past 4 or 5 years? I think that would answer most questions.
Any more questions? Okay, I have another one, if you'll bear with me.
Sure.
Currently, we are in the process of voting for an affordable housing bond, and I wondered if you would give us the benefit of your insights or analysis of that particular proposition.
Great question. I should have talked more about that. I had a question earlier that talked about gentrification. Let me share something with you now. I work for the NAACP, and we're one of the few organizations that's probably open on Saturday afternoon doing legal clinics. I had a young lady come to me last week, about my age. She has a young son, and they were homeless. She had been running all the city of Austin to find temporary housing. She was pretty much educated, had a decent job. She had been laid off, but she needed temporary housing. Nobody would respond to her. So I took a chance. I called 211, which is through the United Way, and a very nice young man answered the phone. And I told him her predicament. He was very nice and very patient. Miss Linder, just bear with me. She said, we have a place downtown called the Salvation Army, and they never turn away women and young children. And this is like 4 in the afternoon. He said, tell her to be here at 6:30. We're going to talk to her and ensure she has a clean, safe place to live tonight. She can stay as long as she wants to while we work on getting some affordable housing. Those kind of places have been they're not getting the proper kind of investment under the current system. And let me tell you something. That happens every day. I was at another forum about a month ago, Department of Justice here, dealing with police issues. The whole forum is dominated by folks who didn't have housing, affordable housing. The money that goes into that bond, mostly is home repairs. Folks who don't have housing, temporary housing, it is absolutely essential. And most folks have no idea how many folks right now running around the city with kids who don't have housing. There are over 2,000 kids in our school system who are homeless. I can tell you it is very critical and very humane. And if we can't do that, we should be happy as a society. I want to find a point on that very same note. I have a client who is 80 years old. She lost her husband 3 years ago. Last year there was a very bad winter storm here, pretty powerful winds that caused a lot of damage here. That storm damaged her home. Unfortunately, she had let her home insurance lapse. She had no heat for about 30 days. We called the city of Austin. They called Austin Energy. They weren't that responsive. Finally, we called the Urban League. And they knew who I was, which shouldn't matter. They knew who she was. And they finally sent some money out. They fixed her home for no charge. That's affordable. That's what affordable housing does. For folks like that on their threshold, our senior citizens, folks who are homeless, many who are females, they provide housing and shelter for those people. Without that, that doesn't happen. It is absolutely critical. I think God this time is probably going to pass. But you know what? $65 million is not nearly enough. But at least we'll have that, I believe.
We have 5 more minutes. A question from Douglas Bauer again.
Thank you for letting me talk again. Early in your presentation, you mentioned that there's parts of Austin with a low voter turnout, and you suspected part of it was the fact they don't feel represented. So it's kind of a two-part question. One, now that we are going to have a 10-1 representation, do you think that's going to make a difference? And the second, what else can we do to encourage higher voter turnout, particularly at an age of voter suppression efforts?
Great question. By the way, I was at a forum on Thursday night called Voting Rights at Carver Museum. It included a fellow named John Dockett, who you might know from the infamous Clarence Thomas hearings, myself, Donald Dix was the moderator, and you had Bruce Elford there that taxes us, Travis County, and also Dana Day Buvar. And that came up. And they kept talking about folks who don't vote, and it was in a very derogatory way. Now, I understand that. But then I pointed out to them, I said, look, when was the last time you guys who are elected went down to a neighborhood and said, hey, how you doing? My name is John Doe. Can I help you? Nobody would raise their hand. My point is, any system that makes more politicians more accountable, they've got to go out and do some work. You got to meet people and greet people and knock on doors. I don't care how modern this society is, you can still do that. I believe that folks have lost trust in government because the government doesn't respond to them. I believe if you do a block party the right way, not during election time, get to know people and ask them what are their problems, and build a rapport and relationship, I think in studies I've seen that increases voter turnout. So I think that will help. And I think also when you know people who've done work in your community who you can call when there's a problem, I get them all the time. I think if you know folks who you have faith in, you're more likely to vote. You're more likely. I think it's an issue of trust. It's also an issue of faith. There's some of the folks among us who get no service who have lost faith in God, and they lost faith in themselves. So I think as politicians, we need to reach out more in a main way and build relationships, bring folks in, get out of our offices, and go out here and do some work in the communities and talk to people. I think that system is going to promote that. It's going to force that. And I feel pretty certain saying it's going to also increase involvement, which is going to increase turnout.
What is the NAACP doing regarding reducing teen pregnancy and drug use issues?
Well, I can tell you this from my standpoint. It's not really our mission statement, but I work a lot with the Urban League, and they get funded every year to address social services. I work with a lot of organizations around town like MELG who are social services agencies. What I try to do, I do a lot of speaking at public schools and private schools to young people, and I try to encourage them to be careful and to be responsible. But I can say honestly that the Urban League gets a lot of money each year to address those kind of issues. I think they're doing a lot of that. But I think also, again, when it comes to our young people, when we talk about things like teen pregnancies, what I believe is that we're talking about still symptoms of a much larger problem. And I think if we look at what's happening in those environments, in those homes where you have a lot of young people who are on their own 24 hours a day with no parental supervision, because a lot of the parents nowadays are working 2 jobs. They're young parents. They're not even at home. So I would ask us to rather than just define the problem, to look a little deeper and look about what causes that problem. If we can find ways to promote living wages in our society and help these young parents out more where they can become better parents and teach them how to become better parents. A lot of it's just experience. You've got kids having kids nowadays out of just circumstances. They don't get a lot of feedback, a lot of supervision, a lot of support. They don't get a lot of encouragement. They get condemned a lot. So I would say larger budgets like the Urban League, people like Capital Idea where young people can get good skills and opportunities. NAACP, we're a partnership organization. Although my job is to sort of deal with the legal aspects of that, I spend a lot of time having conversation and lobbying to make sure that our young people have access to jobs and training, that mothers, for example, can get daycare. You know, we hadn't talked about daycare. Can you imagine young people nowadays, how do you afford daycare if you don't have a job? So you got a lot of these kids among themselves with no supervision, and that's part of the problem. And by the way, if you break down the racial demographics of these teen mothers now, they're beginning to change. There are more Caucasians doing it because as you begin to have less opportunities job-wise and education-wise, it'll affect all societies. So I would encourage people not to pigeonhole that situation. Look at it from a comprehensive standpoint and demand more funding, more support, and more community-based organizations should get involved and try to help young folks through mentorship programs and those kinds of programs. I think that provides more balance.
Thank you for helping us think of some new ways to make government local and even national much more responsive to the public interest. Thank you for taking time this Sunday to talk with us.
And let me add as a final thought, I just think what you do is so important. And I know when I travel and I speak, I always cite the organization. I always cite They Seen Here, who I met, almost 35 years ago. And for just knowing you means a lot to me, and seeing you now means a lot. So I think you do a great job here, and I want to do what I can to make sure folks understand what you do here so more folks can do what you're doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.